Hi, everyone. Welcome to Perfect Prey. I'm so glad you're here. Please remember to subscribe and share this podcast. We're trying to spread the word and information about how to help protective parents keep their children safe. What are the best strategies? As you know, I'm constantly talking about what coercive control is, and it's the underpinning of all abuse. And I think, today we have Meg Groff here, who is an attorney, and she wrote the book, Not If I Can Help It. And it's a really fantastic book, as you can see, that details cases and your experiences also, Meg, in working within the system. So, child protective services, right?
Yes.
Legal aid. I love that you highlight a conversation we don't talk often about in this arena is the idea that people who live in poverty are at a much greater risk for all of these abuses. I often say that one of the major problems we have is that, we are all, as you know, in social media world and everything, talking about these atrocities. But what about these other people who are experiencing it who haven't quite yet been educated about it, right? They don't even know they're suffering abuse. Right? They don't know what coercive control is. They don't know how to navigate the system. I mean, we've got just so many people who are suffering that we don't even have an idea of how many, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think navigating the system is difficult even for the people who are trained to try and navigate it, because it is so full of pitfalls and it is so geared against women and children. In family court, at least, it's definitely geared against women and children. And so to be able to traverse it is a very difficult thing. And when litigants have to go in, mothers have to go in unrepresented, which they often do because of a lack of being able to afford attorneys, they're at a tremendous second disadvantage. I found that a lot of times, it was the abusers seemed to either they didn't feel like they had to bother to have a lawyer because they were so much in control, or they could afford a lawyer, especially in custody cases, and the woman did not. That's why I was trying in my career in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. I was trying to represent as many people who couldn't afford a lawyer as possible.
Yeah.
That was my goal. I worked 12 years for legal aid which represents people for free. And then I went into private practice and continued doing it, which isn't actually advisable if you want to make an income, but it was very rewarding.
It
Been
sounds
very
like it.
rewarding. Yeah.
It sounds like it. So yeah, your career spans a long period of time. You weren't originally a lawyer though, correct? Can you tell our
No,
listeners a little bit about your history?
yeah, I was a dyed-in-the-wool hippie. Got married very young, and my husband was also, and we sort of decided that we weren't interested in material goods and lived in the woods and, had no electricity or running water and grew our own food. We did all that stuff. And I had a series of jobs that were catastrophes because I was so unskilled. But I finally was convinced by my mother to go to college. And then I had an incident that I write about in the book where an abused woman, a young woman, came banging on our door in the middle of the night, and we were living in the woods in a very isolated place. And she was running from an abuser who had beaten her, grabbed the nursing baby, and had gotten no help from the police and was just looking for some kind of help. And I was shocked by it. I had no idea that conditions could be like that, and especially in terms of the way she talked about how the police treated her. And so I thought she was just mistaken or had miscommunicated because she told them that her ex-boyfriend was breaking the door down with a hatchet, and they were saying like we don't get involved. Um, and so, but that is what ended up making me decide that I wanted to be a lawyer if I was able to finish going to school. I was going very slowly. I had a daughter then, and at 5, she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So, and we were poor. So between those two things, I was taking like a course a semester. And I started out old, so I didn't actually graduate college until I was 37. And I had originally wanted to be a psychologist. I really wanted to do that. And I find that psychology, my knowledge of psychology and interest in it and all the courses I took were very helpful to me as a family law attorney. Very, very helpful.
I'm sure.
Um, but anyway, I went to law school when I was 37. And they say in the book that I had decided that I was really too old at that point, but my mother had again come to the age and pointed out that I said it's going to take 3 years for me to finish law school. I'll be 40 years old. And she said, yes, that's true. You'll be 40. But of course, you're going to be 40 one way or the other. You might as well be a lawyer. And so that made sense. I actually was able to use those words so many times in my practice because I dealt with so many women who had deferred their education or had never had an opportunity to do anything, had been so held down by their abuser, and they felt it was too late. And I would tell that story. So I have a whole slew of women who went on to higher degrees and all kinds of success, and I attribute it to my mother's smart
Yeah.
smart statement.
That
Yeah.
is beautiful. I'm thinking, because as you know, we published Framed Woman in the Family Court Underworld, and you started off the conversation by saying that women and children are the most disadvantaged in the system.
Right.
How do you help, like when people get upset about that? Because some people get upset when we say that women and children are the most disadvantaged. How do you help people understand that a little better? Because yeah, it's a tricky
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
There's a lot of things that people get upset about because they're true and they're uncomfortable, you know.
Mhm. Mm.
And I think that there's just so much evidence of it that you have to stick to your guns in saying it. I mean, like when I talk about abusers, I say he, and it's true that there are some women abusers. There are some. But when you have a situation where 90% or even more are of one gender, it doesn't make sense to keep saying he, she, him, her. It just doesn't make sense. We know who it's likely to be and who has the more power in society. And there's so much evidence of it. So I think you just have to show the evidence of it and as best you can. When I was doing my cases, I worked night and day because there was so much to do. But whenever I would tell anybody about a case, they would just be shocked and they would be disbelieving, and it was just shocking to them as the experience that I had when that young woman Lily came knocking on my door. It was like just something that you never dreamed of. And you would say, how could this be so? And I always thought that once I had a minute, I would write the book. And of course, it took me a very long time to have the minute. Um, I think finally the pandemic urged me to slow down, along with my advanced age. But to
The
tell the
stories.
stories about it. And I think that the more that stories can get out, the more that people can read about it, the more that your book and mine can be read by people so that, because they educate. And that's what we need to do. Education is crucial about it.
Sure, sure. The stories need to be told. And I think to your point, exactly. It's always really, I mean, sometimes I hear stories all day long as you did, right? And we're still shocked by them. We still can't believe that this is what is actually going on. And when I've told friends or relatives about the book, they're like, "Is it really that bad? Is it really that bad?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it actually is really that bad." In my TEDx, I recently had a TEDx on coercive control. I use the breast cancer analogy. Of course, men get breast cancer, but they don't get it at the same rate.
Oh, that's excellent. I'm going to use that. I'm going to
Yeah,
steal
and
it.
no one gets offended when we have pink ribbon campaigns and we have the run for breast cancer awareness and it's all women wearing pink. Nobody gets offended, but for some reason, people get really offended around this. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's a good one. I'm going to use that. Coercive control is a very interesting thing because, like, when I was doing my cases, certainly in Pennsylvania, still to this day, coercive control is not in the protection from abuse statute. It's not a thing that people think about in custody. And you really needed to have that physical violence in order to go forward. But coercive control is always there. I've never had an abuse case where there wasn't coercive control always there. And I had a few, and I talk about one in the book where it was mostly that, but he was there was a little bit of domestic, there was a little bit of actual violence. So I was able to use that. And stalking was also something that we have in our statute. So I was able to use that to get into court with him. And he was a dangerous person. Coercive control is a very dangerous and it's a terrible form of abuse.
It is, and I call it the underpinning of it all because I feel like it's just you start with the psychological tactics. That doesn't mean the physical violence isn't going to come. It's when I can no longer control you anymore through psychological tactics, I'm going to use other ways that I've probably already been using, by the way. I've already been using financial abuse. I've already been using stalking and isolation and all those things. It's just some abusers are super savvy, aren't they? And they know enough that if they use physical violence, they may actually go to jail.
Mhm.
You
The
know?
threat of it, they'll do the threat of it, and I think the threat of it is always undercurrent.
Very good point. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah. I was wondering if you wanted to maybe share one of the cases that in the book. Again, I want to show everybody, not if I can help it. If you wanted to share one of the cases in here. I was thinking about the fact that, oh, you supported the opening of a rape crisis center in Lewiston, right? Yeah. And that was, I thought, really amazing. And it was about really understanding how uh, victims and survivors suffer a variety of abuses, right? And that there isn't one catch-all for everybody because I think the reoccurring theme I see throughout the book is that victims would come forward and they would say, I need help. And the systems would like, I think you used an analogy. You said something like if somebody was drowning, right? Or they couldn't breathe and they were drowning, right? And then we say, hey, hang on a minute, I'll get you, I'll
Yeah.
get you. Yeah, so if you want to elaborate.
Um, well, talk about the thing in law. I wanted to, I had gone to law school to be a lawyer, and when I was in law school, as I talk about it in Not If I Can Help It, Ronald Reagan was elected president, and he had a myth with legal services. They were always suing him, and he didn't really have a pro poor people agenda. And so he had vowed to get rid of all funding for legal services, and most of the funding did come from the federal government. So when he became president, it was right when I was in law school, and I thought, I'm in trouble because I never wanted to just be a lawyer who people paid, and I wanted to be a lawyer for the kind of woman who came to my door who didn't have money. That's what, and who needed that kind of help because I saw from the experience with her and what I looked into afterwards how much that was needed, and it fit into my belief system. My mother taught class in anti-Semitism, dealing with anti-Semitism when I was very young. And when I was 7, was the first time that I overheard her say that you must always stand up in the face of injustice. You must always speak out. And I was 7. I thought it was a law actually because she said you had to do it. And it made me very look all the time for injustice because I thought if you have to speak out, you have to see it. Otherwise you could be breaking the law. And um, and so I was always very aware of it, and I'm very aware of the fact that people needed to fight against it, and everyone had to do their part, whatever way they could. Anyway, when I was in law school, I was very concerned about being able to get a job at legal aid because they were closing legal aids. He did end up defunding it by 25%, which caused they never had a lot of money. So I was able to win. I entered this nationwide contest that paid for 2 law school graduates from each state to be legal aid lawyers, to go to a legal aid office, and they paid you to do it. So, and I won that for Pennsylvania. And but one of the things about this fellowship was that you're supposed to spend 25% of your time on a project for the community, which at first I thought, how am I going to do this? I didn't even know the community, you know. Um, but uh, but I realized that it was a very isolated place. It was really more isolated than Bucks County. Um, and they had no, at one point I was looking for an abused woman who had fled from her home and I wanted to see if I could give her any aid, but I didn't know where she was. And I knew that they had these little safe houses and like in the mountainside, but they didn't have a place, an actual place that had all kinds of services. I just realized that that was needed. And I was able to hook up with somebody who was from Planned Parenthood, little office there with a small town and everything was small. And so we started working on that. I didn't stay in Lewistown long enough to see it come to fruition, but it did come to fruition, and
Yeah,
it was it was moving quickly while we were doing it. So
that's
I can't
amazing.
take credit for it because it went on without me, easily without me, but I am very proud of it.
Yeah, no, that does sound remarkable, really. I think maybe it's a good opportunity for us to actually pivot to what we need in the family court, right? To meet the needs of victims and survivors. We recently had a pretty, unfortunately, a very sad case out of Washington State where three little girls were murdered, right?
Right.
And what I think what you said before we got on the call was that this is not an anomaly. That's the problem, right? It just continues to happen where people who have shown the courts in some way that they are not healthy still get access to children. That we, for some reason, think that no matter what a person's behavior, they should have rights to their children. Children are property to some
Right.
degree, right? Yeah. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit
Yeah,
about?
that's a very strong feeling. It's a very strong belief, and it's not even parents' rights, it's fathers' rights. It's a very big, forceful group yelling about not having enough rights. And there is this sense, and historically, that first of all, there's a historical sense that men do have rights over their family, but also there is this kind of comfortable belief that people have that it's good for children to be with both parents. And maybe it's best to be 50-50 if they split up because it's good for them to have ongoing consistent contact with both parents. And that's a comfortable myth because although it is good for children to have contact with both loving parents who care about the children and have their best interests at heart, not all parents fit that description. So it cannot always be true that it is good for children to have ongoing contact with both parents. Sometimes you are putting them into a situation in which they are harmed for life, or killed. Um, and there's just tremendous amount of harm that happens. And when a parent who is a protective parent tries to bring this fact up to the attention of the court, that the other person is dangerous, that the other person is abusive, that the other person is not the kind of parent that we would want to have children be under the control of, then they are considered to be the bad parent. They're trying to undermine what we all know to be a good thing.
Mhm.
And so they're the ones that we look at askance and say, well, then you really shouldn't be involved here because you're not effectuating this contact and this loving relationship that we want to believe has to be there. So it's a thing that has to be fought so strongly. Um, and one of the ways is to change the law so that the law is required to look at whether a parent is any risk to the safety of the child. That's the first thing. I think judges have to be forced to do it. And once they are forced to do it, I think they will gradually start to see it, especially if they get training. Like Caden's Law, which was named actually after a 7-year-old child in Pennsylvania who was murdered by her father while she was in his court-ordered, unsupervised custody. Um, it mandates certain things. We weren't able to get the training of judges in there because Pennsylvania actually has a rule. It's that by the Supreme Court in our Constitution, the judges can't be under the edict of the courts, so they're like separate. So you can't tell them they have to be trained. But Cadence law in general pushes for training of judges and other court personnel who make these kinds of decisions so that they have some kind of understanding of the dynamics of domestic violence and how it is in real life and the effects of it so that they can recognize it, so they can start seeing it and get past the blinders of what they want to believe. Um, and um, and making the safety of children be a priority. So, like in Pennsylvania, Caden's law, it's in terms of the factors because they have factors that judges look at. Most states have nowadays factors to help give them a little guidance. And one of the factors is usually domestic violence, but it's like in Pennsylvania, we have 16 factors. Only one of them has to do with domestic violence. But Keynes law said you have to give priority to that. You have to give added weight to that. You have to first establish that the child will be safe. And I think when you have those laws, sometimes it takes a little while for them to sink in completely, but they sort of force a change, I think. And so I think the most important thing is to work towards changing those laws.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So true, so true. I also really hope that, people understand that, we have to look beyond the violent incident model, right? It's really problematic that we continue to say if someone didn't suffer physical violence, then everything's okay. Or if the mother suffered violence of some type, the children aren't at risk. And the reality is what we know from all of the research now is that children are beyond witnesses or exposed to it. They actually are experiencing it in their bodies. There's a trauma. And I always, for me, it feels like there's two very big missing components. We need to discuss the pathology of abusers because there are character traits that line up in a way that can show us, if we really look, that we can see who had the power and control in that relationship dynamic. Who had it from the very beginning? There was a dynamic that it may have started off slowly and quietly, but then with time, who had more power and control? And it's not hard to see once you see it. But also, what's the trauma to the developing brain? And how do we, as a clinician, how do we how do we prevent the intergenerational? How do we prevent children from becoming more of fawners where they end up in abusive relationships, right? Or more of fighters where they no longer feel that they're valuable or valued just like an abuser and they might exert power and control over others, right? And it's not one or the other, but it certainly, those are two really clear paths if we don't help children grow up in safe environments. It's really frustrating to me, as I'm sure it is too, which is why you wrote the book, and certainly why I, a couple of Aprils ago, said, I have to get these stories out. It was just, I have to get these stories out in a book. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, coercive control needs to be another aspect to to the change of laws. There needs to be that needs to be in there as things to look for.
Mhm.
There's a few states where coercive control is recognized in protection from abuse
Yeah.
statutes,
Yes.
but most it is not recognized, and I think you probably won't be able to get people to sort of understand it at a kind of a deep level, or at least the courts. But if there's certain descriptions as to what to look for, and they're trained in it, and they're forced to see it.
Hmm.
Uh, one of the other problems of getting judges that's really a major problem is the just refusal to accept the possibility that fathers could be sexually abusing a child.
Oh, please.
There is this idea that nobody sexually abuses a child unless they're a pedophile. But that's not true. Abusers sexually abuse children as a form of abuse. It's a form of abuse. It's a good one. It doesn't leave visible bruises, and it is uh, deeply damaging. And so they do it.
Mhm.
And when you suggest that to a judge, it's if I find out if a client comes to me and they've already made that accusation, I am very nervous because I know what danger the mother is in for having made such an accusation. It's just so dangerous. And yet it happens. It does happen.
Yeah.
So,
It's a very prevalent problem that most people don't even want to believe is a prevalent problem.
right.
And, if you think about access, right? So I used to work for child welfare myself. And when you think about access, you would find a vulnerable woman who's financially insecure, who has children or who can have children. And that's going to create the path to as an abuser, having access to those children. So there's a lot of pathways to gain access to children. And we have to believe that a lot of these people are intent on that. That's their intent.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean,
Yeah, I
and
didn't want to suggest that there weren't pedophiles.
oh no, I'm
Yeah, there
sure you're
are
not.
those too. I'm just saying that there also are abusers who
Absolutely.
use sexual abuse as a tool,
Hmm.
and they are not actually pedophiles. It's just an avenue of abuse that they can get away with, and
Yes.
one that
Yes.
judges do not want to believe.
Right, right. It's not necessarily an attraction to children. It's
Right.
just a need for sexual gratification in some way, and the children are used. But yeah, so I think a lot of our listeners, I hope they hear this, right? It's very frightening to your point when a mother says this might be occurring. Since January, I've had about 15 cases now, where I've had moms who have disclosed, they believe their children are being abused. I've had moms who had pediatricians specifically tell them go get a restraining order. There was like lots of proof, and we know this, of course, from Joan Meyer's research. But I've had four moms entirely lose custody by coming forward and sharing and disclosing. I have a couple of moms who have chosen to not tell the court.
Right.
Hmm.
I mean, when you think about it, I mean, what a horror. You say it, and the child says it. Then it's like even worse sometimes. Then it's like, oh, they're in cahoots, or the child's been brainwashed, or the child is enmeshed, and then the child is sent to stay with the rapist, with the abuser.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's
It's like it's unbelievable, really. So I can understand why people have a hard time believing it. The problem is that it's true.
the problem that exactly it's true, and it is not an anomaly. We're not talking about a sliver of cases. We're actually I'm talking about virtually all of my case. Like it's like there is just so much that people don't want to acknowledge is happening within the family court system. Yeah, and we need more advocates and more allies and people who understand it. I think the system's become complicit in exerting coercion and control over the victims, like
Yes.
the institutional betrayal, as Judith Herman talks about in her book Truth and Repair. Yeah, so I mean, I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts, and I really appreciate you being here and sharing with us, your book. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
Well, I guess I would just say again, I think that education is the key, and education will lead to, along with advocacy, will lead to changes in the law. We have to change the law, and people like us and others have to write about it and speak about it whenever they can and get it out as much as possible. And the whole intent of your book and mine were is to educate people and to show them. Mine is all about real cases that I handled, and how and also mine is a little bit of a primer for lawyers as well. I try to give tips to lawyers because lawyers really piss me off. They're so obsequious in court, and there's no need to be. And I don't think, and it's not. I found that my success was because I was not, but they're afraid to confront a judge. They're afraid to um, to point out a judge's uh, poor thinking, and I think that that's a mistake because that's the only people who are going to do it to a judge, and it needs to be done, and it can be done. It really can be done. So my book is full of little tips to prospective lawyers or lawyers to try and urge them along on the ways that you can uh, do a good job as a lawyer, and urge them to do the kinds of law that are needed. We really don't need too many more corporate lawyers.
Well, I appreciate you writing it because we need to have more lawyers, right? I mean, we need more people who are doing this direct work in the court system to actually be elevating the conversation. So, appreciate it very much. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, it's a
And
pleasure.
again, everyone, make sure you get Not If I Can Help It. Meg Groff, attorney at law. Thank you so much.
Thank you.